Yep.
We're talking about the courtyard and the visit from von Ramstedt, and from that point we were to be marched to a prison camp. And I guess as I'm talking about this, most of us had no idea or no, we didn't know what to expect. Uh, but we did know that we were not very welcome by by the German forces. In fact, I think at one point they told us that we should have, that if we think we've got it tough, good for us because we should have stayed in the United States and not come over there to wage a war. So they were quite angry, especially with the way the war was going. They somehow sensed that the United States was quite a strong force.
So what year would this have been then?
This would have been 1944, the fall of 1944. Um, so our trip back to the prison camp began, and we had all kinds of visions of what a prison camp might be. As we know prison camps, or thought we knew prison camps, there'd be 3 square meals a day with a warm place to sleep, but we were wrong on all of these accounts. Um, so we began walking back, and that was a episode in itself because mainly we had no food to speak of, and as we were marching or walking back into Germany, um, we would pick up things along the road, such as apples that had rolled off of an apple tree, or even a field of freshly picked cabbage fields, and the cabbage was gone, but the cabbage roots served as good food. The only problem by eating apples and cabbage roots, most of us began to have diarrhea from eating that. Um, we were also marched through many small villages, small towns, and people there were totally upset with an American. Uh, they would they would try taking our coats or hats or whatever they could pull off of our backs, and many of the soldiers lost their coats. And this was cold weather. This was like Wisconsin in December, quite cold. In fact, some of the soldiers, they made them sit down and take off their shoes, and some of the soldiers continued the march literally in their bare feet, just in socks, no shoes. Well, I somehow lucky enough to keep my shoes, and
Did you
with,
keep your coat?
I don't remember my coat now or not, or I don't know if I even had a coat. I don't remember that. But they were very hostile. In fact, going through some of the little towns, I recall, the streets are very narrow, like one lane might be in here, and people were shouting at us from the 3rd floor. And the worst thing they could do, and they did, they had hot water. They would pour hot water out of the 3rd story window down onto our heads, hot boiling water, hoping to scald us or something. But evidently the worst they did was just get us wet because we had some clothes on and the water wasn't that hot.
Do you remember the water hitting you personally?
Oh yeah, it kind of came out by the kettle full. It wasn't like a steady stream out of a garden hose. It would be like they'd swish out a bucket full and it hit somebody, and then 2-3 minutes later another bucket full, and it hit somebody else. But anyway, we were quite apprehensive about going through these towns. We would have rather gone around the town or anywhere else, but not through these narrow streets.
Do you think the German guards made you march through the towns on purpose for that
Oh,
reason?
I don't know. I don't think they were totally aware of the fact that people would pour the water. They were probably trying to control the people with the water and with the taking of shoes and coats.
So they were trying to protect you somewhat?
Oh, I don't know, not, they tried to portray an image that they were civil people. But to us, it wasn't anything civil at all. In fact, maybe even the guards that were marching us, there weren't too many, like maybe 1 per 100 men. Um, but we had no choice in the matter. We were at their disposal, so to speak. While we marched for days and days, we finally got to a town where evidently we weren't making enough headway walking or getting to the prison camp in time, so they began to load us in boxcars, which again puzzled us because we didn't know where the boxcars may be going. We're putting these boxcars, and the doors were locked and closed, and it was literally dark in this boxcar. And let's say 50 to 100 men in a boxcar. We had no water, we had no place to go to the toilet, and like I said before that, we had some of us had diarrhea, so now we had no toilet, so we just had to go anywhere in that boxcar that we could find. Eventually, like on the second, third day, there was a stench of, body waste and whatnot in that boxcar. I can also recall being short of water and you were thirsty. There was frost, like a half-inch frost on the inside of the boxcar, and we took our thumb and scraped the frost to get water from that.
Okay.
As we're being marched to our prison camp, we had all kinds of visions of, food and whatnot. But I do recall on our way, we were promised a meal of sorts, and we were all kind of looking forward to that. And that night, we happened to, well, I guess I talked about boxcars earlier. I might go back to that. Things didn't work on the boxcars because the American fighter planes were out in force, and they began to strafe some of the railroad yards, and our boxcar was in a railroad yard. And we got strafed several times, but not seriously. I think we only lost 1 or 2 soldiers. But they took us off the cars and we went back to walking on foot. And with that walking on foot, we were offered a meal that night. And we happened to be on the outskirts of Frankfurt, which is on a river, and across the river is Cologne. Well, we never made it to Cologne. We only made it as far as Frankfurt in a large so-called warehouse where we were to spend the night. And we heard the hooves of horses coming into this warehouse. Lo and behold, yes, we were getting food, but they were raw potatoes, a wagon load of raw potatoes. And each of us were allowed to only take 1 potato. And the guard that drove the load of potatoes had a whip, a horse whip, that would whip your hand if you try to take 2 potatoes. So that was our meal for that night. So that night we
Okay.
So that night we spent in this warehouse where we got the potatoes. And it was quite a large load of potatoes. I don't know, I would say like maybe 50 bushels of potatoes. But they all went, because by this time, not only were we alone, our little group of prisoners from our unit was only 30, but there were 30 from other units, so possibly there might have been well over 100 or more prisoners in all, but they weren't all from my unit,
So now you're in Cologne,
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt.
The next morning we crossed the bridge and went into Cologne. This is like a main highway.
Okay, but as you were marching, they gave you potatoes off this truck or off this wagon. So while you were marching, you could eat this raw potato.
No, we ate that like in the evening and before we went to sleep.
Where did you sleep?
In this warehouse, cold, drafty warehouse. Can you imagine how terrible that must be? Not only from the standpoint of being cold, but here you are a prisoner, like maybe they're going to take you out and shoot you like a dog the next morning. Your life wasn't really worth a hell of a lot, and that's a hell of a feeling. You know, all of a sudden your life is in. Before we were under the protection of the U.S. Army. Now we have no one to protect us. So that was kind of hard to take. How you?
Do you remember if you were able to sleep, or how would you feel knowing?
Hardly. I guess you'd sleep, but whatever went through your mind in your sleep, I don't know. And if you did sleep, is because you were just plain wore out, not physically, but mentally and physically. It must have been just, you know, you just couldn't lay your head on a pillow and doze off into a sleep. So that was our episode there. Eventually, by marching, walking, town after town, it took us total of 8 days. Total of 8 days from the time we were captured to the time we reached the prison camp. And again, we were promised, because I suppose they could tell that we were getting very weary, and they were afraid of the Red Cross, that somehow the Red Cross organization would find out that we were being mistreated, and that wouldn't play well for them. So we, after 8 days, we arrived at the prison camp, and we were offered another hot meal, like I said, or a meal. And it was a meal, and it was not hot, but warm. It was boiled potatoes, and well, they call it a soup. It would be about the same as if you took one potato in a cup of water and cooked it, and after the potato was cooked, you'd break up the potato into pieces with no spices, no salt, no pepper, just potato and water. And you had there were no dishes or spoons. I guess a lot of us carved our own spoon out of wood in the prison camp. And your bowl was your steel helmet, you know, like a bowl. And a lot of the prisoners, when we lived at the prison camp, would spend half of their prison time cleaning the bowl, scrubbing this inside of the helmet just to make it clean. But little did we know that you could scrub all day, but bacteria are still there. You've got to hit it with either hot water or some disinfectant. But nonetheless, we had this soup once daily. And then after we were at the prison camp for several days, we got better news. We not only would get this potato soup, but we also got a slice of hard rye bread. And it was hard as a slice that thick would probably weigh a quarter of a pound. It was just hard. I don't even know how they cooked it or baked it, but it was a slice of bread at night. But again, you'd eat that slice of bread without a drink of milk or water with it. You just ate the bread. Can you imagine how that would digest so poorly? And half of us were half sick already, you know, trying to eat that bread. But nonetheless, my sleeping buddy, we were each given each given a bunk, you would call it, which was about 3 feet in width. That meant if you slept side by side, there wasn't enough room. So you'd have to sleep, and everybody had a sleeping buddy. You'd have to sleep on your left shoulder, and your buddy would have to sleep on his left shoulder. And if you turned, you and your buddy both have to turn at the same time. With that, we got a blanket, and I don't remember the blanket. It was like a horse blanket, but that, and it was probably made for a horse. It was like 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. If you pulled it up over your chest, your feet would be sticking out. If you covered your feet, your chest would be sticking. It was just half size, but that was our blanket. With little heat. Heat was scarce. Wood, fuel. I don't even recall if we ever had coal, but we had some wood. But the barracks where we were assigned to sleep, during the night it would probably be 50 degrees at most. It was cold. And in our bunks we had no mattresses, but there was straw, and after sleeping in straw it kind of separates, so every day you'd have to refluff the straw so there was an equal amount of straw all the way across. So that was your bed. During the day, you had no place, no chairs to sit, only the edge of your bed. And that was hardly big enough for 2 people to sit there. And about physical exercise, about all you could do is walk round and round the barracks. You maybe go around that barracks like a penned animal. You went around that barracks like 100 times in one day. You just walked and walked aimlessly, sort of. You didn't know why, but you were just walking because, well, it maybe felt good to keep the bones warm. We had no other. We didn't have tennis or whatever, so that was our only form of exercise. Then in about 2 or 3 weeks, some of the soldiers were already sick when they were captured, began to die, so it was quite common, and I always say that we had like 1 funeral per day, and it was as much, a funeral in the daytime was as much as a meal during. It became very common, and every day you'd attend somebody's funeral, and the funerals are very simple. We didn't have caskets. All you do is salute the bag, like a body bag that was carried on some boards by 4 or 5 people, and they went up the hill, and there was a cemetery there. That's where they buried them. And as a part of being an American soldier, to be sort of patriotic, you could either march, walk with the group all the way to the cemetery, or you could just stand by your barracks and salute. Most of us saluted, just salute as they carried this person by, and most of them that died were dying of things like pneumonia, basic things, diarrhea, all of that kind of stuff that could easily be prevented with any kind of little medication, but we had none. No medication or no medical assistance of any kind.
Did you know most of these people as they died?
No. But you didn't have to know him. He was a soldier just like you. You know what I mean?
Did that bother you at the time, or how did you feel about that?
No, we didn't cry or whatever. A soldier never cries. You just saluted and kind of held your teeth tight and kind of whatever, It was a big deal and it wasn't. We were like dying like flies. but Eugene, this buddy of mine that I shared the barracks with,
What was his name?
Eugene Leisure, he's from Steubenville, Ohio. And I've gone to Ohio one time and was in Steubenville. I couldn't find hide or hair.
Do you remember how to spell his name, last name?
Yes, Leisure.
How do you spell that?
Leasure. Just like leisure time, but it had an A after the E. And his name was Eugene. And he had a nose a little bit like mine, pretty good sized nose. And the GIs, everybody had a nickname. Popsicle was pretty common for me. And Gene, because of his nose, everybody would do this. They'd honk honk. His name was Honk Leisure. You never call a soldier by his right name. You always give him some derogatory, nasty name like Bummer or Joker or Popeye. We had a Popeye. He was the old man, 39 years old, that couldn't, but he had kind of bulgy eyes and skinny frame, but everybody called him Popeye. I never did hear his real name, whether his name was Peterson or Johnson or what, but he was just Popeye. Hey Popeye, come here, I'll carry your pack for you. Geez, yes, thank you, because he could hardly move. He was 39 years old. He couldn't keep up to us 18-year-olds. We could run. Popeye had a hard time to walk. Okay, well, anyway, so much for getting...
Well, let me ask you this. As these people died, as you saw them died, did you wonder to yourself why you weren't among them, or what did you do differently?
Not really. Your turn was coming, but just so. Maybe tomorrow I die, so what? Our lives at that time was so low that we didn't care if we lived or not. It just kind of like, I think if the German guards would say, okay, we want somebody to line up against the wall for target practice, I think some of us were so low that we'd raise our hand. Just kind of a, you weren't in good thinking like maybe you should be, you know. You'd raise your hand and say, yeah, I'll volunteer. Well, what a dumb thing to do, but you know, when you're in that position, it's hard to explain how you feel. Well, let's get off.
Well, I want to ask you some more questions. Did you know at the time about the Nazi Holocaust and execution of Jews?
No, but we did know. We used to get a little newspaper called Stars and Stripes, I think it was called. A little newspaper like monthly, and it was only like 2 little pages, Stars and Stripes, and we somehow learned that because the German army was getting so desperate, they wouldn't take prisoners. They took 30 men out in the field, in the snowy field. I've seen that picture in Life magazine since that, and they just mowed them down. The hell with you prisoners, mowed them down with machine guns. And there were 30 bodies in this field. And that kind of worried us. And it run through our mind, especially when somebody like Rumstead comes riding down into that village where we were first captured. And I think they took all of our watches and rings and whatnot in that first village when we were first captured. And Romstead came down there swearing and cussing. Oh, you never saw a man so mad in your life. And swearing in German. All of us thought, oh, here we go. Up against the wall, you know. We kind of already had assigned ourselves to the fact that, you know, all Romstead had to do is say, mow them down. And we couldn't do a damn thing about it. But anyway, we were aware of that shooting, but evidently it didn't happen to us. Somehow we were what, unscathed, or whatever you call it, from being shot down. And of course, well, let's see, where did I leave off? I left off with my buddy in the prison camp. Oh, we didn't think we were going to ever die because we were doing something better than most soldiers. Some soldiers were so weak and sick, they just lay in the bunk all day. Wouldn't even walk around. Eugene and I would walk around the prison camp, and we collected grass roots, quackgrass, white roots, whole bunch of them. You know, all you had to do all day long was pick roots. Well, in 8 hours, you can pick a lot of roots, and we'd eat those. In fact, some of the highlights of our food, we used to catch sparrows in our barracks that were flying from one end to the other, and we'd cook this, clean it out, feather it down, and cook it. And when you got done cooking, you had about an ounce of meat.
How did you catch the sparrows?
In the barracks, they had like a
Okay.
our barracks was like a cathedral ceiling, open, and after you do something about a dozen times, you get pretty good at it. The sparrows would fly from one end to the other, and then they'd sit. Well, it just took two of us, one on each end, and when you chased the sparrow up, he flew to the other end, and the guy down there would catch him by hand. When the sparrow came by, you'd stand still and catch the sparrow. Then we even caught like rabbits that got tangled in the wire fences. You know, in places we had like just barbed wire strung out, and some places there was even rolls of wire, and the poor rabbit, if you could somehow corner him, you could catch the rabbit, you know. But you got kind of good at that. Grass roots, sparrows, rabbits. Anyway, Eugene Leisure and I, we somehow felt that we were eating better than all those other guys in there.
Did the other guys see what you were doing and try to copy it? Or?
I don't recall that. Yeah, on the sparrows they did, because we always had to, let's say if there were 5 of us that had a sparrow, but we were only allowed 2 pieces of wood. So when we made a fire, we had to make sure that we got all 5 sparrows cooked. And we cooked them on a wire. You'd get the stove going hot, and then you took the lid off the top. There was a lid on top. The stove was about that high. Took the lid off the top, and on your wire you dip your sparrow down, and you can't leave them down there too long or you'll be black. So you'd have to bring them back up and dip them down slowly, and you could tell when he got kind of brown and crusty, he was probably done. So that's how we cook sparrow. So there'd be 5 of us, and all of us, I'm just saying 5, there might have been 4 or 6, I don't remember, but we'd have to synchronize, because the 2 pieces of firewood that we got would only last so long. And if each one cooked separately, so there were sparrows going up and down in that stove like crazy. And it was all for naught, because a sparrow, like I say, if it weighs an ounce, that's pretty good. Then what else? Cigarettes. The Red Cross sent cartons upon cartons of cigarettes to our prison camp. And of course this didn't make you live better or longer, but I thought I'd mention it. The cigarettes got to the office or the headquarters of the prison camp, but they were never distributed to the American soldiers in that prison camp. The guards, we found this out later, that the guards were always smoking cigarettes. Where the hell do you get all those cigarettes, you know? So one day we followed some guards. They were just walking, and we kind of stayed our distance, walked behind them, and one of them dropped the cigarette butt, and we saw camel on the paper. Oh, now we know where our cigarettes are going. They're smoking our cigarettes. So at one time we'd follow a guard that was smoking, hoping that he dropped his cigarette butt, and we would confiscate it. And then we'd make a new cigarette out of two butts. We could make one good cigarette. So we did that for a while. So we even smoked sometimes. But when the German guards found out what we were doing with those cigarette butts, they got wise to it too, and they would take their boot and rub it into the mud, so it was unretrievable. You know what happens with a cigarette butt in mud. So that came to an end too. So anyway, I don't know what we're missing.
Well, we talked about you and Eugene and what you did differently.
But nonetheless, whatever we did must have been right, because we both survived. The last time I saw Eugene was, I think, in France. I'm not sure if it was Camp Lucky Strike, but they had different places along the coast where you'd go back by truck. Or no, we went back by plane. We went back by plane, C-47s, back to the coast of France, and then we got on a ship.
When you got liberated.
After liberation, yes. Well, I missed that part. We got on a ship, and then we were headed back to the United States. Liberation.
Well, you're kind of jumping ahead, but can you tell, I remember the story you were mentioning about the sewer lid cover, or some kind of drainage cover.
Oh, that was in the prison camp. I don't know if I talked about that, but we were constantly being strafed by American planes. Small planes, single engine, usually, sometimes P-38s with twin tail, and it got so bad that it was nearly like one or two Americans would get shot by the plane per week, you know. We were raided like nearly every day. So we talked to the camp commander, asking him about, there was an old tennis court behind our barracks, that if he would supply us with some lime, that we could print PW in about 10-foot letters, so these American planes would stop strafing us. And he got violently angry. He said, no, he says, we don't print, I remember that so clearly, we don't print PW, we will print KG. He insisted on KG. KG means Kriegsgefangen. That means prisoner of war. Prisoner of war in German. Kriegsgefangen. Well, he could have printed both. PW, at least the American planes. German planes weren't strafing us, so why print Kriegsgefangen, KG? But he argued violently, saying, and he was mad because we as prisoners brought up something so dumb. But nonetheless, we were being strafed all the time. Eugene Leisure and I, as buddies, we found in our prison camp, they had a sewer system but it was like a septic tank, but every week or so the honey wagon would come with a big dipper and empty these septic tanks into a wagon, and the wagon would, like a barrel, big barrel, and haul it out onto the fields for fertilizer. And Eugene and I figured it out that where these septic tanks were, they had a big lid on them, and those lids were heavy and they were hard to pick up unless you had a screwdriver or something to pop them up. Well, we figured out a way that we went to this particular one and we just left the lid ajar a little, just enough that you could get a hold of it and push it off to the side. The next time we were being strafed, we'd run for that septic tank hole and dive into the hole, jump in there, and sometimes we had shit up to our ankles. But that was okay. We'd get out and clean them up. Had all day to clean them up, you know. So that was kind of a little bit of a story about in the prison camp. I guess the day of liberation of the prison camp, we never knew that this was happening, but occasionally we would ask, we saw airplanes high up in the air. They were like a tiny mosquito with, in the wintertime, and leaving